And just introduce yourselves anyway in your relationship to this.
Okay, I'm Marvin up Church. This is my daughter-in-law, and Mr. Bernstein, your speaker's is her father.
No, he's my daddy.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So I'm Nancy, and this is my daddy, who I'm very proud of.
And I guess I'm going to be the speaker. And here's my daughter.
And you're AF.
W2 Alpha Foxtrot Alpha
Right.
Alpha W2PAT.
That's right.
Good. Glad to have you, Marvin. My policy and philosophy is, since so many of the speakers that we have travel in from somewhere else in the world, around the state, they have to leave and get on back home, let them go ahead and speak. And Marvin's going to hang around a little longer, but he'll go ahead and go ahead and speak anyway. It was funny, I asked Marvin would he like to speak to us later on in the summer or something. He said, well, let me speak pretty early, I may not be here then. So, Marvin, I'll let you go ahead and speak, and then I'll have a little short business meeting after that, okay? Come on up.
As I've said, my name is Marvin Bernstein, and I'm fairly old. What I'd like to start with has nothing to do with the radio. My father was born in 1885. My mother was born in 1888, both of them in Buffalo, New York. They had 4 children. My older sister was born in 1908. My older brother was born in 1910, and I was born in 1915. My younger brother, living in Virginia at this time, was born in 1918. What's rather unusual is I knew my father's father, my grandfather. He was born in 1838, and he was living with us when I was born in 1915. He died 3 years after that, but it astounds me that I've lived so long. What happened with radio was totally out of my mind, certainly, and I believe also my dad. He had the ability or desire that his children do better than he did. So my older sister got the piano. She was going to be a pianist. My older brother got a baseball glove, skates, of course, in Buffalo. And my younger brother got the, if you remember the Christmas presents, erector sets, things you put together mechanically. With me, he got a hold of the ham radio operator living only 2 doors away from our house. He wanted some suggestions for my 10th birthday. And I think he really thought this fellow who played with sparks would think of something that he could buy in the electrical range. He had no idea that they were even playing with radio. Anyway, this ham told him how he could get to the department store in Buffalo and go in the basement and get a crystal radio set. The crystal, being lead sulfide, with a cat's whiskers contact, is a semiconductor. It's an AM detector, a very simple radio. The ham put up an antenna, a ground wire, got the radio working, and I was not greatly impressed. My dad probably listened to it more than I did. So that birthday present really was not a great favor of mine. The thing that happened next in 1915, in 1929, when I was 14 years old, an interesting thing did happen electrically. My dad had found out a few years after the crystal radio disaster that hams were allowed to make AM receivers with vacuum tubes. The problem during World War I is that the Navy who wanted radio had to deal with Marconi radio, of course. There was not an American radio company in existence then. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I'm sure you're familiar with that name, was an assistant secretary of the Navy and was responsible for the radio equipment. He got Congress to pass a monopoly called the Radio Corporation of America, so that at least the U.S. had a manufacturer and also a laboratory development position in radio. And one of the requirements in that law was that licensed amateurs could build radio sets. It didn't specify they had to be radio sets for hams. It was taken for granted that the hams could make AM radios. My dad bought one, and things went along pretty well until around 1929, when lightning hit the church close to our house, and a side branch of the lightning strike hit the antenna of my dad's radio and burned it out. My mother, who was terrified of lightning, said that the large antenna my dad wanted, and it was put up by a couple of the fellows helping the hand put a 2x4 mast and an inverted L antenna. That all had to come down, the radio had to get thrown out, and I asked my dad if I could take it up in the attic and play with it. And that was my first experience working on a burned out front end. No, I talk better standing. I think.
Okay.
Keeps me awake. So anyway, that was the first experience with my first ham operator. In 1930, my dad happened to be talking to a friend of his, fellow named Hatter, I don't know if he's the person, who had a radio store. It happened to be across from the saloon. And my dad would stop in the saloon after work and have a few beers. Now those were, as you probably know, were non-alcoholic beer. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution prevented anyone to sell, buy, or drink liquor. So anyway, I had played around with the burned out front end, took out part of the stuff and got the radio working. my dad related the story, or ready to talk to this fellow named Hatter with the radio store. And he said he could use me to open up the radio store after high school. He worked late. He was a linotype operator at Buffalo Evening News. Didn't get out until after 6. So I stayed in his shop because people were bringing in radios to be repaired, and it involved pulling the tubes out, testing them, and then rejuvenating them. Now, if you ever heard of rejuvenating vacuum tubes, and if you're interested in the story, it's kind of interesting. The first vacuum tubes were like incandescent lamps. They used the same kind of tungsten film, and it had to be run at very high voltages and high temperatures to release the required amount of electrons. General Electric, who obviously you know made electric lamps, also made X-ray. Tungsten was hard to run through the dies and reduce it to the small diameter required. And they found out that if they alloyed the element thorium, a couple percent of thorium with the tungsten, the films could be run through the dies more easily. And someone at GE Laboratories involved with the X-ray tubes tried some of this tungsten. And as a result, the vacuum tubes were renamed with the letter A, so the 201 vacuum tube burned out in 500 or 700 hours. The 201A, which would have the thorium tungsten alloy, ran much for a longer time at a lower temperature. So I would test the vacuum tubes, and if the emission was low, I would put them in the so-called rejuvenator. You flash the tube for 3 or 4 seconds at very high temperatures. It boils out some of the thorium, which forms a thin layer by aging them without any voltages on the elements. And that was the rejuvenation thing. He also talked about hand radio, and he was by 1930 selling an AC operated radio instead of the previous battery operated radios. And the trade-ins, he showed me how I could take some winding off the coils and do it to the 160 meter band. And when I heard hams talking to each other on voice, it kind of got me more interested. So anyway, that's the second ham that had an effect on my life. We come now to 1931. I'm in high school, third year of high school. We had to take physics as one of the courses. And the physics teacher, believe it or not, was a ham. He put on a demonstration one time of something he built. It was simply a 3-tube audio amplifier with the first tube grid having a screen attached to it. He had a Bakelite rod. He rubbed it with a wool cloth, developed a static charge on the Bakelite rod, And as he flipped it toward the screen, we could hear distinct clicks. And he said what he was doing was throwing electrons off of the big rod, which struck the screen and discharged, actually electrified the dust in the air, and it was the dust particles that was doing the clicking, because you can't have free electrons in normal air pressure. But what he did to help me was that he had a circuit diagram for a 2-tube regenerative receiver, and I had enough parts from the radio shop that I put together my first radio receiver, a 1-tube detector, oscillating detector in 111. So by 1932, I was copying code pretty good, and I thought I'd try for a license. I flunked the code test, and in those days you had to wait 90 days before you could take the test again. During those 90 days, one other thing, the physics teacher told me to start buying QST. You could get it from any of the stores that sold magazines. So during that 3-month period, I read some stuff in QST and learned some more. The interesting thing is that in an ad from a company in Temple, Texas, there was an ad for a quartz crystal unit. And from the description of it, and then I read some information in one of the books that I had taken out of the library, you could make a crystal oscillator and it would maintain the frequency very accurate or very stable compared to the normal LC oscillators that everyone was using. So I put together a crystal oscillator, a buffer, and a pair of push-pull tubes. All of them were 201As. There was a problem in those days in getting power supply. There were very few rectifiers yet. I had intended bringing one. That was well, I'll hold that off to the next time I'm speaking, I'll bring it. It's interesting to see what they used in the 1920s to rectify voltages suitable for a transmitter. But to make a long story short, until 1933, my rig was that simple 201A with batteries operating it. A storage battery for the film, it's in 45 volt. Batteries consisting of enough cells to get 45 volts, and I think I used 4 of those to get 180 volts. So I was probably running 3 or 4 watts of power. In 1933, Sears Roebuck's financed the Colonial Radio Corporation and proceeded to have radios made in a factory that was used in 1918 for machine work required for the war. What was interesting about that plant, it was an enormous plant, but they had one section that was used for the production of Sears Roebuck Silvertone radios. They put an ad in the paper, and it distinctly said ham radio operators. 350 people showed up outside the gates of the plant. The engineer at the plant came out and had us hold up our hands if we had a license. We got a job application. We were allowed inside and then interviewed. And from what he showed us a circuit diagram of the radio they were producing. And I got a job as a circuit checker. My job was to take one of the completed radios off the production line and compare it to the circuit diagrams that to be sure that it was being wired correctly. I worked at that job, at that position for 6 months, and I found only one error, so they canceled the position, which was nice. What happened then was I was transferred into the troubleshooting area. Some of the radios didn't work. They would not align correctly, sensitivity was bad, were noisy, different problems. And that was an interesting job. I enjoyed that. You might also be interested to know that in the production line, the chassis would have the, thank you. The production line had the larger components, the transformers, filter capacitor, tuning capacitor, all those, and also the sockets were riveted into the chassis. All that was done with men. But once that was done, the chassis went on to the production line, and there was it was all women, by the way, which was nice. So there was a model that the engineers had made of the chassis in front of each of the people, or the women in the production line. First an assembler, then a solderer, then an assembler, then a solderer. And at the end of about 20 women, the finished unit came off the end of the line, and again, a man inserted the vacuum tubes. Then I went to the test area. They had a bunch of screen rooms with a Bernstein signal generator, and I had one until I moved down here. It weighed about 100 pounds, but it was a great signal generator. I really should have brought it down here. I could have got a couple men to bring it in and show you what it looked like. It was huge. But anyway, I became a troubleshooter then. And occasionally, there's another thing I must mention. Everyone on the production floor was paid the same hourly rate. Anyone want to guess what it was?
25 cents.
How much?
I say 25 cents.
It was 25 cents. You worked 40 hours, you got $10. That was the bad news. The good news is you could work as many hours as you wanted. So the men that were married worked 2 shifts. They worked 16 hours a day. But anyway, let's see. Okay, we're at the troubleshooting business now. The work was also done by a system called NORM, short for normal. There was a time study engineer who checked every position and figured out the average time that you were supposed to accomplish each operation. In the troubleshooting group, if you started to work too long on any one unit, then you couldn't make the normal rate, and they didn't like that. So after a while, most of the guys would put the unit in a rack. I found that I had a unique, in my mind, ability to troubleshoot by making some tests and figuring out what part of the radio set was bad. And probably the 6 months of signals of tracing the circuit helped me. But I could troubleshoot faster than most of them. And the foreman on the floor happened to notice that I was going over, and when I had completed my normal requirements for number of repair, taking one of these hard ones and working on it. So he made me the supervisor of the troubleshooting group, and I got a nickel raise. He made radio sets only for Sears Roebuck initially. And by the way, one of the sets that was made was a 32-volt radio that was sold to farmers that in those days had no electric, but they had these wind chargers and storage batteries for a 32-volt system. Starting in 1940, things really got interesting. We saw that they were building a room inside the plant with one entrance, and actually it was a subcontract with Bendix Radio. Bendix Radio had a contract with the government to supply 25-watt radios, transmitters, to the Royal Air Force. So we made many radios that were shipped over to the UK from 1940 until the time I left. In 1936, I knew enough I knew enough that I was able to get commercial licenses, radio telegraph and radio telephone, and try to get a job. Buffalo had cruise ships in the 1930s that left Buffalo on Sunday night and cruised from the Lake Erie and then up into the Sound up in Owen Sound up in Canada. Turned around and came back down the Detroit River and then back into Lake Erie and back to Buffalo by Saturday. So I went aboard the ship, or it was in the harbor, and talked to the radio operator. And he said, can you touch type? And I said, no. He says, well, you never get a job. You're going to have to learn to touch type. So I went to night school and learned to touch type, and That's how far back my ability to operate a teletype goes. And on that note, oh, well, I'm getting near the end of my work at Colonial Radio Corporation. Because I had the commercial radio telegraph licenses, hand license, had the experience of 8 years with radio. I received a telegram 1 week after Pearl Harbor directing me to report to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Civilian personnel on the 22nd of December, 3 days before Christmas. And which I did. I left on Sunday night and said goodbye to my wife and my daughter Judy, who was born in 1940. And my family drove all night from Buffalo to New Jersey and managed to arrive at 9 o'clock. Was hired and fingerprinted, filled out a lot of forms, photographed, and was taken by a young girl to the ground radio branch of the Signal Corps Labs and introduced to first the branch chief, and then I was introduced to my supervisor, who was named Norman Lee. He was a mechanical engineer out of City College, New York, and his assignment was to come up with a replacement for the quartz crystal, because the Signal Corps had contracted with Western Electric to build a transceiver, an FM transceiver covering the frequency 20 to 30 megahertz FM with 10 crystal positions, so that they could easily change frequency. And I have a book which relates some of the problems of the crystal industry in World War II, in which Rommel was defeated primarily because the Germans could not change frequency in their mobile units and tanks and command cars and whatever else they had. And whereas our guys could just hit a different channel of a 10 and get on a different frequency and effectively have control of the operations without the Germans finding out. So that's about the end of my story. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have, if anyone have one. Yeah.
Spoke a lot about your life in general. Can you tell us a little more about your ham career? When did you get your first ham license, and what kind of equipment did you have?
Well, like I said, before I got the job and had some money, it's all stuff assembled on a breadboard. You know where the term breadboard comes from? Actual wood breadboard. The receiver was built on one and the transmitter was built on another. It was all home built with stuff that I had taken up out of the radios that had been turned into radios. So
Did you have CW or phone or what man?
it was purely CW. I didn't get into the phone man Okay, this should be of interest. Around 1935, QST started right up about the solar cycle. The peak was in 1936. In 1935, they showed a simple frequency doublet, the twin triode, and suggested if you operated CW on the 20-meter band, take a little bit of this energy and double it to 10 meters, and put a small antenna out. And they had a calls heard list, and soon I learned that I was being heard with probably maybe 2 or 3 watts of power on 10 meters. At that time, 1935, I was making more than 30 cents an hour, by quite a bit. So I went whole hog. I built a crystal rig with doublers to 10 meters, a 210 buffer, and a pair of IMAG 50T push-pull amplifier. I also built a Class AB modulator using the 6L6s. And then I put a hole in the roof. My dad came home from work and saw me up there. He had just put a new roof on the house. And he comes in and he looks up there and he says, well, actually, he didn't look up there. He went out on top of the front porches away and got up on the roof. He says, what are you doing? You're pruning up. So I told him I was going to put a beam antenna on top of the house and have a manual rotator and plumbing pipes coming down. 3-element Yagi. And by 1936, I was having a ball. I also, by the way, in 1936 bought a National FP7 receiver. So that's what I wound up in 1936. When I got married, it was a bigger problem. That was a rig I built in a big, I think it was like a telephone rack. It was a metal base and these 2 uprights and a cross piece of, and took panels that bolted it into the, so I made a really neat rig, too big for the apartment. So I had another smaller rig that, trying to remember, I think it had an 807 in it, but it was, again, that was a CW rig. That's about the story. All right?
Okay.
Yes.
What is the filament voltage on the 201A?
Didn't get it.
What is the filament voltage on a 201A?
What was the filament voltage on the 201A?
Oh, 6 volts, 6.6 volts, or 6.3 volts, yeah. It was a regular storage battery, yeah. Although, there was always a pot, so you could adjust the voltage a little lower. The emission lasted longer.
Okay, any other questions?
So what are you doing on radio these days? I know the answer, but I'll hear your answer. So what are you doing on radio these days? Primarily just Mars?
What am I doing on radio now?
Tell
Yes.
them what you're doing now, Daddy, with your nets. You're on the nets on Friday morning and Friday night you're over it.
She
We
knows.
do the report every month, all the call signs, Mars, you go to the conference every year.
I want to say this, that I believe that I have some marbles left, primarily because, well, let me backtrack. I started with radio teletype in 1948. Now, a teletypewriter, you could not buy one. You could only lease it, and I don't believe the Teletype Corporation ever leased a teletype to a hand. But beginning in 1948, there was a fellow up in New York City who managed to get the Teletype Corporation to allow him to arrange for the purchase of a Model 12, and I say again, a Model 12 teletypewriter. It would cost $50 plus shipping. And my particular teletype came from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1948. And the only band we could operate on was 2 meters. This same fellow put up a teletype repeater on the upper floor of the New York City municipal building. He had a receiver on one side and a transmitter on the other side. You would get on the receive frequency with a marked signal. It turns the transmitter on, and you can now repeat through New York City at a fairly high level and cover all of northern New Jersey and out, halfway out on Long Island. In 1950 or 52, somewhere around there, Herbert Hoover Jr., the son of the president, arranged with the California Telephone Company to allow Model 26 printers to be sold, again at $50, to hands. You had to sign a paper saying you would not sell it to anyone but another hand. So I did a lot with radio teletype, including joining Mars. Again, at least until 1951, we couldn't operate on HF with teletype. I was told Air Force Mars had a radio teletype net, and so I joined, and then found out the only station that I ever heard was the one at the Mars station at Fort Monmouth. So it didn't work out too well. But again, getting back to what I'm doing now, I'm on the VoiceNet unless I have to do something else. But 6 out of 7 days a week, I'm on the VoiceNet. And I believe it's helped me keep some of my marbles. You've never heard the term?
Oh, yeah, oh, yes.
We've just lost ours.
Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, and it may be because the receivers are so different now than they were back when you started, but I sort of marvel at what it must have been like without all the telephone wires and all these, things that are generating noise, fluorescent lights and all that. Over the years, have you seen more and more background noise when you sort of scan through frequencies, or is that not really changing?
I think the noise is the same. It's just that the techniques or the ability to correct errors, determine or find out what the error, a particular error in a group of characters, and then correct it. I think mostly there is still noise.
No, I don't mean teletype, but let's say on voice, like here at this shack, a couple of guys did some noise checks and found that some of these transformers are just making all kinds of racket and got the power company to fix those. So I just, you know, when you go from batteries in 1936 to nowadays with all this electrical noise, I didn't know if you noticed that it was any different or gradually increases over the years.
Well, the big difference is that when I lived in Buffalo, the closest house was 50 feet away, and then on the street was 30 feet wide. You had all the houses on the other side. When I got married, it was even worse. We were in an apartment. It wasn't until I got to New Jersey, this might be of interest. Knowing there were going to be a lot of hires at the labs, in 1940 they put up, they took over 10 acres of land, farmland, and built 350 apartments. In that 350 apartments, there were more than 30 hams. You talk about, yes, of course during the war there was no ham radio. The first band we got was the FM, 2-meter FM. But noise is noise. My daughter picked out the house I live in now, and the closest neighbor is across the street down along the lake. So he's probably 600 or 700 feet away. There's no home on my side of the road. If you go south, you gotta go about a mile or two before you come to a house. I should have brought that picture. The previous owner took a picture of the house, and you can see it's all trees around. It's the most quiet place I've ever had. So to get away from the noise, you gotta get away from the sources, of course. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Good, thank you, Marvin.